Okay, so talking about Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic. So this is essentially Weber's argument, right? You have the traditional value system, which emphasizes acceptance of inherited status in the existing social order, obligation to share, to give charity, and these cultural values, he argues, leads to low economic growth. On the other hand, the Protestant Reformation comes in here, cutting, cutting the traditional value system, or changing the traditional value system with what's called the Protestant ethic, as we've shown, with these kinds of values. Okay, and so what that does is it leads to capitalism, rapid economic growth, and prosperity. Okay, so now this is sort of where Weber stopped, right? And as of his writing, in the early 20th century, okay, his argument was, a strong one. I mean, empirically, it was empirically backed up. Here we have, in terms of the growth rates of countries between 1870 and 1913, right, of the top 11 countries, okay, all but two, Japan and Belgium, were Protestant, or predominantly Protestant. Now, if we shift to the post-Second World War era, we find that that's not the case. Okay, Protestant countries have sort of slid down, and what we have is Catholic countries and Japan here up top. So, does that mean that Weber's argument is wrong? Well, excuse me. Engelhardt says no. Weber's argument is correct, and how Engelhardt essentially saves Weber's argument is by arguing for his theory of what's called post-materialism. Essentially what he argues is that post-materialism, and the idea behind post-materialist values is that generations or individuals that grow up during a particular time will aspire to sort of different values than the values in which they sort of grew up. So, as an example, think about your grandparents. Most of you probably grandparents or even great grandparents who were born or raised during the Depression. Now, their attitude towards money has been is very specific or very peculiar, right? I mean, we all hear the stories of the frugal generation that went through the hardship of the Depression. Okay, and so they saved, they were very frugal, whereas the generations that grew up in the post-Second World War era grew up during a very prosperous time. Okay, so they, on the other hand, tended to shy away from putting many of the values in sort of material values. They moved towards, having grown up during a time of plenty, they moved towards focusing on non-material or post-materialist values, such as respect for the environment, respect for things like women's rights and human rights, a need for self-expression, etc. And the fact that the values in these societies move from materialist values to post-materialist values then slows down economic growth, and that's why, according to Engelhardt, these Protestant countries were growing much more slowly during the post-Second World War era. Okay. So Engelhardt sort of looks at economic development and the decline of materialist values, and what he shows is that here on the y-axis he has percentage of materialist values minus percentage of post-materialist values. Okay, so these countries up here, so the higher the number, the higher the level of materialist values in that society. And so what he shows is that there is a negative relationship. So the more post-materialist societies here have gross national products that are higher in 1950. Okay, now economic growth from 65 to 84 shows that the higher the level of economic growth, okay, the higher the level of materialism. Okay, so it's not very strong, but the relationship, but it's there. All right, I showed you that as well. So this is the Whitefield and Evans argument. Okay, so essentially what it comes down to is that they're arguing, look, which theory, rational choice, or political culture can best explain, okay, the differences between things like certain political values, etc., in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. Okay, so what they show is that in fact attitudes towards. They argue that that economic experiences, so sort of the post-communist economic experiences, if they are much more likely to affect attitudes towards political attitudes like democratic commitment, etc. What other also economic liberalism and social liberalism. Okay, then the rational choice theorists are correct. If they're not very strong, and it's really political experience that is more important, given that these two countries shared a political history, right, between 1919 and 1993, then the political culture argument is much stronger. Okay, so what they show, through these various economic, multiple regressions, is that for some, that there's a mixed sort of bag, but for the most part, that the rational choice argument is the stronger of the two. And finally, the Alesina and Giuliano article, right? They assess the impact of culture as well. Okay, so you can answer these questions, and these will be important.